Welcome back to the David Kurten Show here on today's News Talk TNT. And I'm delighted to have with me Mark Windows on the show today. Now, Mark runs Windows on the World, which is a podcast and or teaching series. I don't know what you call it, but there's so much information that you've put out there on your broadcast, which is really, really interesting and important for people to know. And you've been doing this for 10 years or so, or maybe,
Oh, a lot
maybe
more than
even
that,
longer.
David. I started off in about 2006, 2007, and I saw how the courts had changed in the UK. So that led me into looking at what was actually going on. And then, of course, we had the big society in 2010, and there was a massive sea change in the way, especially local governance operated.
You talk about communitarianism and quite a lot, and I don't think many people may not have even heard of that word or even less understand what it means. What is that, and why is it a danger to our society?
Well, in 2010, Cameron announced the big society, and out of that came communitarianism. The word started to be used, but generally it goes into local governance, and it was used actually by the Clintons, and everyone in the US after the Clintons was trained in communitarianism. But it's a kind of intellectual thing, but it impacts on all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because hence we get all rights come with responsibilities. In other words, we have no inalienable rights anymore. And the word comes from community and communism. It was actually thought up by John Goodwin Barnby in 1841, and he wrote the Communist Chronicles, and he set up the London Communitarian Association. So communism and communitarian views were pretty indivisible. But where it broke off was when we got into a thing called the responsive society, with people such as Amitai Etzioni, born Werner Falk in the 30s. And he was one of the main proponents of communitarianism globally. So his view was that people were not taking enough responsibility within a community, and that people would have to take more responsibility. So therefore, all rights that are granted come with responsibilities, whereas, of course, all rights actually come from one individual having rights. You can't have collective rights. So that's the point. So from that, we get consensus meetings where people are steered into the intended outcome. So in other words, it's a completely deceptive system. It masquerades or masks itself as community, but it is, in fact, top-down totalitarianism.
So does this happen on local councils? I mean, you talk about consensus being driven and people go into meetings and then, they think they have an opinion and they can present their opinions, and we live in an open society where there's a level playing field. But is it the case that people can go to meetings and then be, manipulated into accepting certain points of view and then pursuing a certain agenda, such as the climate agenda or the woke agenda or the trans agenda and things like that?
Yes. Well, all these agendas, David, are drivers of change. The climate change agenda is the biggest driver of change humanity has ever been forced into and under. So, in other words, these other agendas, which are basically identitarian agendas, are put in for divide and rule purposes. And it's all part of the big society, in that everybody participates. But in actual fact, this illusion of participation is completely false, because the outcomes have already been decided, and people are finding that out. They go to these local council meetings, they find that they're not being heard, that it appears that these new developments, these new impositions, the low traffic neighborhoods, were all implemented before, and it's part of an ongoing project, which it is. It's a very long-term project, which started with the Agenda 21 goals, and it started off with a thing called Global 2000. But then we go back. The first communitarian document was actually Our Common Future in 1987, which was also known as the Brundtland Report. Gro Harlem Brundtland was a communist and the Prime Minister of Norway. Now, I don't want to get too complicated with this, but people have to know what the principles are, the core principles. So, in other words, people were trained into this new system of sustainable development. So when you're dealing with the council, you're not dealing on an open playing field. You're dealing with an agenda which is already in place, and it is very difficult to stop. But hence you get consensus meetings, hence you get Delphi technique invented by the Rand Corporation in 1953 to gain group consensus. So I'll give you an example. So if you've got a factory and you want all the employees to agree, you don't want the unions to get too powerful. So what you do is you put your own people in there, you kind of infiltrate, and you steer them into closing the doors that you don't want them to go through. It's a bit like salesmanship. So say you've got a window salesman and he goes, oh, that window's rotten, it'll have to come out. We've got one in the warehouse. You can have it for £1,200, but if you wait till next week, it's £1,500. Now that is a kind of steering. But at any point within that process, you can say, I don't want the window and I want you to leave. But with this, you can't do that, because what they do is they put the goals as part of the objective. So in other words, say the Citizens' Assemblies on climate change, you cannot question anthropogenic global warming. You then go through a 3-day or 2-day indoctrination program where you are told what you are needed to vote for and what you need to do. For example, the Citizens' Assembly on climate change in Oxford, everybody in the country has now voted to spend £25,000 upwards on retrofitting their houses. Everyone in the UK has agreed to this. Did they know? No, of course they didn't. A group of people were given a series of steered questions, and they were made to agree with them.
Wow.
That's how it works. So it's kind of an imposition from above that masquerades as community. Yeah.
Yeah. How do we fight this? I mean, you know, obviously I see infiltration happening, and, you know, I'm leading the Heritage Party. I've seen people try to come in and then cause trouble, or try to come in and steer us to, you know, give up this policy and give up that policy. I mean, I think we are in some sense insulated against it because I wrote the manifesto at the very beginning and put that out there. But I know we have councillors at the parish and town level, the very lowest level, which don't have too much in the way of decision-making and legislative power. But even at that level, you see they're filled with Tory, Labour, Lib Dem, Green, and they all are pushing the same agenda. You know, they're all for the climate agenda, which, as you say, is an agenda of change, and they want to do this to restrict car use and to put up 5G towers and whatever that can surveil people. How can we fight against this? I mean, can we do this within the system that we have now, or should we try to crash the system and make a whole new system, as some people think that we should do?
I think the second option is not on the table, because that's already been taken into consideration. So what tends to happen is people who are outside the narrative will be steered as well. The communitarian society has infiltrated everything. I was shocked at the level of infiltration around 2013 in Waltham Forest. A whole new set of people appeared in the borough, and I found that this was going on all over the country. We'll get to the solution in a minute, by the way, but first of all, we have to address what the problem really is. And what happened was, I was getting people contacting me from around 2010 onwards about these people who they knew nothing about, who'd come into the community. A lot of them were starting NGOs and lobbying groups for this agenda. So hence you get locally things like Mums for Lungs, Our Children Can't Breathe, etc. Now, these are steered groups. These are consensus groups. And that's the trick. So when you see the word community, it's them, it's not you. So you have to take back this at a community level. And I know that the Heritage Party is trying to do this, and you're doing exactly the right thing. It's a big uphill struggle because, of course, the people who you're trying to get on board are being distracted all over the place by so-called freedom fighters. And this is part of the steering. And this is one of the things that made me turn my back on some of the things that were happening, in the respect that I saw it wasn't going anywhere. So there was a bit of conflict over that with certain people, but now they're seeing that, in fact, it was right that this system is in place. But I do have a manifesto which you can look at it's just put empower your community into windowsontheworld.net and scroll down to the end. And there's a series of steps there which you can use as a template. And what that does, it makes it so that they can't accuse you of being far right. They can't accuse you of being anti-climate change. They can't accuse you of being a denier of anything. And that's the trick, because as we know, It's all about ad hominems and logical fallacies. The whole of sustainable development is all about logical fallacies. In other words, they'll turn around and say 97% of scientists agree, which is a logical fallacy. It has no basis in any form of reality and never did. So they use these template arguments, and when they lose the argument, they will shut the meeting down or shut the subject down. What you have to do cleverly somehow, and this is a great challenge to people out there, you are in a mimetic war, and the best meme is going to win. So you have to be very aware that this is a soundbite orientated program. Now, I've got a lot of the quotes that you can use against the climate change agenda. For example, Ottmar Edenhofer, who's like the big head of climate policy throughout the world, Mercator Institute, IPCC, etc. He's openly stated this is not an environmental project. Climate policy has absolutely nothing or little to do with anything environmental. So you have to separate climate policy from the environmentalism. So in other words, the policies that they're following are not environmental. And you've been a real champion of this, stating, the solar farms, the green energy doesn't work. I went to a conference several years ago, David, called the Green Energy Conference. The two suppliers to the national grid said, we do not know why the government is lying about renewables. Both of them, two separate companies said this. And they were very open. They were getting top dollar from the government when the national grid is at peak capacity, which is very often now. They said the future in Britain is power cuts, but we don't know why they're lying about renewables. But everything is backed up with buried diesel generators called the STOR system, which clicks in. So people don't know that these buried diesel generators are owned by offshore companies, many by Saudi Arabia, especially in Wales. This was a few years ago. So when we look at the green agenda, we have to look at what it is. Now, some people who've been through the university system see it as, oh, it's a corporate agenda. Well, that's half the story. But unless they get the full picture of what it's really about, which is control and management and depopulation, then they're still going to be, it's the corporates or it's the Tories. So what this system does, it gets people stuck in a certain place and in certain groups. And that's the trick. You have to break out of those groups and see the bigger picture.
Yeah, it looks like they are fabricating scarcity deliberately.
Yes, artificial scarcity is how it's run. Absolutely.
Yeah, indeed. You know, one of the most disappointing things to me is something you sort of alluded to there, is that we're trying to do some good things in the Heritage Party and actually talk common sense. But then you'd find another group set up, whether it's an NGO or something that sounds, like they agree with us and actually maybe even copy what we stand for word, and then compete with us and then take people and lead them into nowhere, and so nothing gets done. Have you seen that happen over the years?
Absolutely, that is one of the key tenets of communitarianism. In other words, nobody will be left behind. There's something for everybody. The Soviets used to call it the system of moods. In other words, you give people pressure valves where they think they're rebelling or they're having a voice. In fact, of course, they're not, which is why I pointed out what happened with the so-called COVID protests. I'd seen all this before. I saw the steering years before that in the Occupy protests when Soros came in, took it over. Right. Now, one thing I would say, David, is that every single one of these template groups, whether it's your local council or it's a protest group like Extinction Rebellion, or the other side of Extinction Rebellion, which is the so the globalists need the anti-globalists to implement their policies. So they get everyone to do it. That's communitarianism. Everyone's agreed, you see. So what you have to do is be able to see outside that. And they have facilitators, co-facilitators, and they steer you through a series of questions, which obviously they remove everything out of the way when it gets towards the intended goal. So you're basically being steered and funneled in one direction. And once people realize that, then they have to use countermeasures. So in other words, it's very difficult for you to point out that this is happening because it's going to make you look paranoid. You go, well, they agree with you. Do you see what I mean? This is the problem I had explaining. It says, well, you can see what they're doing. They're slightly subverting what you're saying, but you say that and they go, oh, you're paranoid. I've had this for years, and say, no, they're taking you down there. And they go, no, they're not. They never said that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But you can tell because I think, I've been in politics since 2015. I was elected in 2016. And then when I tried to get re-elected onto the London Assembly in 2021, I got all these groups sprung up and they said slightly similar things to me, but slightly twisted and then stood against me. And I think, why are you doing this? Why don't you just join in so we can all be one party together and support each other and maybe get a seat? But I mean, do you think that there's, we just got 2 or 3 minutes left. Is there any point? Do you think it's worth engaging in the political process, or at all, or is it not worth it anymore? Do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that people should get behind the Heritage Party. I'm not just saying that because I'm on air with you, because you are the only party that offers a solution. There is no other party that is offering a solution. And of course, the others are well funded and they're all going in the same direction. We know this. But I was going to read you this manifesto. For some reason, my screen's gone black here, which I don't seem to be able to do it. But it's basically in an article called "Empower Your Community" at windowsontheworld.net. Go to the end of that and just read those principles. And we've got lots of other stuff. We've got the solution, the community revolutionaries, big society change agents, the communitarian agenda, empower your community. When people watch this back, they can click onto them, and they will all reinforce what we've been saying here today.
Absolutely. I'd definitely recommend anyone look at your website and the videos that you made. There's a wealth of knowledge there. It's incredible. I don't know if you remember everything that you've said over the years or not, because there's so much there.
Well, I do sometimes, David. I mean, I put on something from 3 years ago when they were talking about this rollout of the 5G millimeter wave technology, but it was all about a council meeting. And what I would say to people is nothing's changed. There's nothing complicated about this system. It's incredibly simple. It's incredibly simple. Let me read this out, David, because it's come back on again.
Yeah, we just got about 30 seconds. So read it.
Yes,
read a little bit. That'd be great.
Okay, we are an unaffiliated group of local residents concerned about the lack of democratic process in local government planning and policy. That covers everything. We will remain unaffiliated as individuals acting collectively and within the law towards a truly inclusive democratic process where all voices are heard. We are not affiliated with any group or organisation whatsoever. This does not mean, however, that we do or do not endorse other groups. We do not agree with arriving at a consensus through being steered into predetermined outcomes by trained facilitators, either working for the council or public-private partnerships. We deem this to be against the public interest and an affront to the democracy.
Sorry, I can't argue with that. That is amazing. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for joining me. This is today's News Talk, TNT.